British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has promised to deliver Brexit by October the 31st. That's despite the blow dealt to him by the UK's Supreme Court. It ruled today that the PM's move to suspend Parliament was unlawful.
Mr. Johnson gave his reaction to the ruling in New York, where he's attending the UN General Assembly.
Obviously, this is a verdict that we will respect, and we respect the judicial process. I have to say I strongly disagree with what the justices have found. I don't think that it's right, but we will go ahead and, of course, Parliament will come back. I do think there's a good case for getting on with a Queen's speech anyway, and we'll do that. But I think the most important thing is we get on and deliver Brexit on October the 31st.
Britain's lower house of Commons is now set to convene tomorrow after the verdict said that the suspension was null and void. Mr. Johnson had suspended Parliament till mid-October in what critics said was a move to squash debate on Brexit policies before the October 31st deadline. Ollie Barrett walks us through the landmark ruling and what it could spell for the Prime Minister.
As soon as the decision was announced, Mrs. Miller began the English proceedings.
To decide whether this was indeed a matter for the courts. The government had argued all along this was a political issue and shouldn't be being decided in the courts at all. Well, the Supreme Court rejected that, and rejected that roundly. It then moved effectively to the next phase and decided that Boris Johnson's advice to the Queen to suspend Parliament was unlawful because it was not a normal prorogation. It was extreme in its effect on the workings of democracy, and this means that Parliament is effectively still sitting, that the suspension of Parliament was deemed by the court to be null and void and therefore never really came into effect. This has huge potential implications for Boris Johnson, but also for the UK's democracy, for the role of courts in Britain's political life, and for the role of the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land here in the UK. So a very, very significant ruling indeed, and it was unanimous, all 11 judges agreeing. Many people had speculated that this would be a split decision. Well, Boris Johnson is immediately being called upon to resign by opposition party lawmakers. He said before the ruling that he wouldn't do so, but we shouldn't rule it out completely. That is one of the routes that Boris Johnson could get to the general election that he so dearly says that he wants. And certainly, in terms of his personal reputation as Prime Minister, it will, with many British voters, not do him any favours at all to have been found to have misled the Queen with the advice that he gave her to suspend Parliament. That advice deemed to have been incorrectly given by the Supreme Court. At the same time, though, it does again allow his supporters to portray him as being the man fighting for the people, fighting for Brexit against the UK establishment.